Hello and welcome to another episode of The Exchange.
Many countries abolished slavery a long time ago. It seems like a problem from another era, and yet slavery is alive and flourishing today.
With more than 30 million people trapped in various forms of slavery globally, how real is the issue on Australian shores? Is it a question of out of sight, out of mind?
Slavery ended hundreds of years ago. Or did it? The idea of owning someone seems barbaric in today's free world, yet there are more people in slavery than ever before. It isn't just happening globally, it's local, right here, in our own backyard. How do we end human trafficking and stop slavery on our shores?
Jenny Stanger is the Salvation Army's manager for the Freedom Partnership, an initiative to end modern slavery. She's the founder of Australia's first refuge for trafficked women and has dedicated her life to bringing an end to human trafficking and slavery.
Dr. Mark Zirnsak is director of the Justice International Mission Unit of the Uniting Church of Victoria and Tasmania, a spokesperson for Stop the Traffic, and has campaigned against child labour since the 1990s. Great to have you both with us. Jenny, tell us, how real is slavery in Australia today?
Look, I think it is something that's quite surprising to a lot of Australians. We don't think of this country as a place where these kinds of practices would occur, where these kinds of abuses and exploitation would be happening. But really, in the last 10 years, the Australian Federal Police have conducted over 500 investigations into situations of slavery, servitude, forced labor, human trafficking, and there have been 17 convictions. So it is a reality, and I think we've only just begun to uncover the full scale of slavery in this country.
Mark, what constitutes slavery and trafficking? Are they synonymous terms or are they
No, they are separate terms. Slavery normally refers to ownership, so where a person is owned by another is normally the international definition of slavery. At a lesser level than that is forced labour, where a person is not free to choose their work and are compelled to undertake that work, and that might be physical coercion or it might be psychological coercion. And then trafficking is the process by which people are moved to a place where they may be subjected to exploitation, or where they are subjected to exploitation.
How does that happen in Australia? What are the particular industries that may be vulnerable to slavery?
Look, there's a wide range. So the one that got the most attention is obviously the sexual exploitation of women in brothels has come up as the early issue, but subsequently we've seen issues arising around the construction industry, around hospitality, around restaurants, for example. Agriculture is another area where we've seen substantial evidence of people being brought into forced labour situations through human trafficking. There are other industries at risk as well, but they'd probably be the main ones.
Yeah.
What are some of the industries you've identified?
The ones that Mark has mentioned. We've certainly worked with women in the sex industry across a range of services within that industry. Domestic workers is another, again, I think surprising feature of labour that we may not think really occurs in Australia, but people living both in private homes out in the community who have been trafficked here for slavery, and also people working in the homes of diplomats. Certainly there's another again, surprising one. We call it slave-like marriage, where migrant women may come under the, false promise of what seems to be a good marriage, a chance to build a family together with someone who cares about them. But when they arrive, they may be put to work in a family business. They're not allowed out. They're isolated. It often presents as sort of domestic violence, but there's some type of exploitation of the woman on top of that. And surprisingly, we've also seen one case of trafficking for the purpose of organ removal in Australia. Again, another surprising one that Australians wouldn't think that could happen here. So a whole range. There was another case of athletes brought over to be professional athletes, boxing, and they wound up as domestic workers as well. So really, when you start to understand the full scale and scope of people's vulnerabilities and industries where those vulnerabilities might be preyed upon, really the lid is sort of blown off of the container. There's quite a lot.
It is fascinating, isn't it? Because often when you talk, even today, about slavery, many people think of something that happened many years ago, or if it does happen today, it happens in other countries, but the fact that it's alive and well in Western countries like Australia, like America, and unsuspectingly, many of the people in society are actually supporting it. This has kind of gone viral online, and it's. I know, Mark, you've seen this. What are your thoughts when you had a look at this?
Look, I thought it gave a very positive reaction. The reality, though, is that sometimes even where people may suspect goods have been made with forced labour, they may not always choose to behave as well as this clip actually showed people here. So I think a lot of our push is actually to try and say government should have a responsibility to make sure goods being sold in Australia, for example, are not made with slavery or forced labour or human trafficking.
Yes.
So it's actually not a choice that consumers make. That
Yes,
at the end of the day,
it would actually make sense. I mean, we have a law against slavery, and yet we allow goods to come into the country that have been clearly made in inappropriate circumstances. So it just doesn't make a lot of sense to me.
Yeah, it puts the consumer in a really difficult position. You know, if we just think about even everything in this room, what we're wearing, you know, the things that we're utilizing every day, the fact that so much of what is in this country is brought here by seafarers, many of whom are experiencing quite exploitative conditions on ships, and our economy is built on the backs of seafarers. Again, it just, you know, it's quite a complex, big topic.
It is a complex topic, and it's a very embarrassing topic when I take my children shopping, because they refuse to come now. Is this fair trade? Is this single origin? Has any child been abused in the process of this? In fact, I rang 4 tyre companies to get tyres for my car, and they said, well, these ones aren't, but these ones are. And I said, let me understand that you know that children are put at danger for these tyres, but not for these tyres. And eventually I got an organisation that didn't use child labour, and that decision to do that can be quite laboursome for people who don't understand the backstory of why they're doing it.
Is it a fair assumption that if something is very cheap, that it's probably the result of slave labour?
No, I don't think you can draw that conclusion that it's the result of slave labour, but you could normally assume that if something seems unreasonably cheap, there is some form of dodgy activity. It might not be slavery, it might be labour exploitation, it might be tax evasion, it might be tax avoidance. There's probably going to be something pretty dodgy about what's happened in the production somewhere along the line, but it wouldn't necessarily indicate slavery.
Okay, but if you can get a T-shirt for, well, as we saw on the clip,
$2.
for €2, it's likely that there is something, as you say, dodgy.
Yes, somewhere in the supply chain, someone's getting ripped off, and whether it's, as I said, whether it's labour exploitation, slavery, or tax evasion, for example, you know, you may not know, but you should, you know, if a deal's that good, you know, there's probably something wrong with it.
Sure. Jenny, are the number of cases escalating that we're seeing in Australia?
Look, that's a tough one. We did get some new offences that came in 2013 that we didn't have previously, that I think to some degree have leveled the playing field a little bit, because our previous response was very much designed, as Mark said earlier, towards criminalising the exploitative slavery type conduct within the sex industry. Now, we have a whole raft of new offences that apply really evenly across industry. With that said, I'm not aware that we've actually been able to bring any charges forward in some of these cases that you've probably seen on the news recently, you know, in agriculture, in construction, in some of these other industries.
So no prosecution has taken place?
I'm not aware that there are any charges yet using the new offences. The one where there's been a dramatic increase is in forced marriage. So one of the new offences that we have is forced marriage, which is where one party does not consent to the marriage, and there's usually some type of pressure or coercion involved. There has been, you know, that's an issue that's been in the community for a long time, but it's really emerged now because it's become a crime. The awareness has started to get out, and young people are disclosing their concern for their own risk. And it is something that is an issue for adult women. Our Safe House has always worked with adult women who've experienced forced marriage. So it's about that statistic, at least on the government side, has gone up from 0 to about 35% of the referrals that they're currently receiving. And that's quite a high number.
It's a difficult one to actually, you know, to work out, because you can't assume that, I mean, you know, you think, well, are people being brought in from other countries? So therefore you can't assume that every ethnicity that has married an Australian male, for example, is that been, you know, a forced marriage? Then I know couples who are in a similar situation like that, and they are so over people, you know, referring to her as a mail order bride, or, you know,
well,
how do you...
important, the distinction between arranged marriage and forced marriage. You know, arranged marriage is when someone consents to the arrangement. So it's really these scenarios where, you know, there is force or coercion or really undue pressure on one or both of the parties. And look, that's an issue that we see affecting, you know, locals. That's not necessarily something that's affecting a migrant group. It's first generation, second generation migrant communities. And again, it's really a new emerging issue, and it's a tricky one, again, for the community and government and child welfare agencies to respond to in a way that I think gets good outcomes, particularly for young people who don't, you know, they don't want to see their families prosecuted. No, so I think in that sense, that requires a very nuanced, different approach than some of the other, different than the rest of the kind of human trafficking slavery framework.
Sure.
And it's a really confronting one for our community right now. But the referrals are there. The referrals are there.
Yep.
Look, the other issue that I think is in there is this issue around stigma or making inappropriate assumptions. I mean, often, you know, simply because people are migrant workers working here, we shouldn't automatically assume they're being exploited. So I think, you know, the community needs to be alert to the possibilities of human trafficking, forced labour, slavery, but shouldn't make assumptions all the time about every person in a particular group. So I think there's a balance to be struck.
Sure.
And I think there's a bit of a danger about making the kind of assumptions you were talking about just a moment ago.
Yeah, very good point. We are heading off to a break. If you'd like to know more, you can head over to our website, of course, and we'll be back in just a moment with Street Talk and more.
Are you aware that slavery is a problem here in Australia?
No, I'm not.
Not really, but it doesn't surprise me.
No, I wasn't.
Yes, I think, I know it's a very big problem in Brazil.
I wasn't aware it was a particular problem, but I have heard about it, especially in regards to the sex industry.
No, not really, because when I think about Australia, it's like modern country, and I don't think about that.
I did know that there is people that are like refugees or people who have come to refugee families in Australia have been enslaved in various different ways, and I do know that there's probably, I'm speaking out of not real factual knowledge, that there are people that are working under conditions that are not appropriate.
Do you think it's a case of out of mind, out of sight?
I just didn't think that in our society that would have any part, actually.
It's the product of the capitalist system. If somebody can see an advantage by having cheap labour or free labour, by abusing people's rights, they'll take that advantage. It's a weakness in our system.
Oh, all these things always are. If you don't know about it, or if it's out of sight, then you don't know about it, and no one complains about it.
If it could exist, where do you think it would exist?
Probably in factories and in maybe in sort of people who are sort of coming into the country to do some work and getting taken advantage of.
Clothing manufacturing type things in the backyards, stuff like that, which is a form of slavery. They don't pay people properly.
Textile, maybe. So if you talk about this topic, of course, countries like Bangladesh, India, and things like that.
We have situations where, for example, housekeepers or people live in house help are essentially in slavery. 457 visa, there's been a number of cases where people have been brought in what could be described as close to slavery conditions.
What do you think we can do to sort of help the situation?
Probably make more public awareness and make sure that people know what their rights are.
I think publicity is the big thing.
Actually, it's really good what you're doing, because it has to be, like, everyone needs to know about it, because I know that there's a lot of people that doesn't know. So, I don't know, I think we really need to create critical mass, so the government may try to create some new policies and to help them.
First of all, publicise it. It's like a lot of sort of quasi-legal or illegal things. It's very hard to police it, and so I don't blame the authorities so much, but publicise it, and at the end of the day it comes down to what Australians will put up with. And if they complain enough, then things will happen.
some very interesting comments there as Sandra joins us in the studio. A lot of people seem to be completely unaware of slavery.
Completely unaware, or thinking that Australia is such a modern country that it really doesn't take...
Couldn't exist
Yeah,
here.
it might, but yeah, it really spoke loud and clear to me that there's not enough publicity around this issue.
Yeah.
And also that they use those terms synonymously, slavery, or they think everything's regarding slavery, but it might be forced labour, like you were mentioning before. So, yeah, I was wondering whether there is enough publicity from your perspective working in the industry.
Look, I think, you know, the government does have quite a robust framework on this issue, but the awareness raising is kind of the hole that I've seen over the years. I mean, I've done this work in the United States as well, where there's been quite a lot of resourcing of the public awareness raising, and I think that's really where we really need to be putting some of our resources in the future, because, yeah, largely, if you go out and ask people, you know, they just think it doesn't happen here. But I think when you start to tease it out, you teased it out a bit, people did come up with their own ideas about where it might be happening and came up with some of their own solutions too. So
I think, though, there is some willful blindness in some parts, though. Certainly our experience with the agricultural industry would suggest that, you know, there's perhaps a knowledge that labour brokers might be risky in terms of working with them, but some people who use those labour brokers are willing to sort of not ask the questions that should be asked, and they should know better to actually ask those questions.
So how does that look? So someone's coming into the country, they're giving them a job.
So you've got an employment firm basically who brings people into the country and then hires them out to a final employer who might be a farm, for example.
Yes.
Now the question is, does the farmer actually ask the right questions around, you know, is this person actually receiving their legal entitlements? Are they free to, you know, what kind of conditions and position are they under the labour broker? And we basically don't have laws effectively governing labour brokers here in Australia, unlike many other countries. So it's a loophole there, and it is in this case, you know, people can be benefiting from the exploitation or the forced labour of people and not asking the right questions. So choosing not to ask the questions when they should know.
We're assuming that those people have been brought here by force, or they've been brought here by...
Usually they've been tricked into coming, or, you know, they've been told one set of conditions and terms, and when they get here it's something different.
Right.
Or they suddenly find that, you know, huge amounts of money are taken out of their pay for accommodation or other claimed expenses.
And
so they're not getting what was...
cash in hand jobs? Is that what
quite
how
often,
they're being
yes.
paid?
It'll often be cash in hand, and you know, in some cases the person who's being exploited will be encouraged to cheat the social security system as well, to supplement. So there can be, you know, some really very dodgy practices out there.
So I think the deception is really important, you know, in the context of Australia. You know, most people are coming here willingly under these false pretenses. So, you know, sometimes there's this thought, oh, that it's an issue that we can somehow spot at the border. No, people are coming here under these false pretenses. They're coming willingly and they're coming legally. They're not coming, you know, illegally. So, you know, again, how do we detect, and then how do we safeguard people once they are here? So, you know, they do come under these false pretenses, and it's basically a bait and switch, and you find yourself in a very vulnerable situation and not really sure who you can trust, how you can get out of that situation safely.
And talking about that, you set up the first safe home for women in that situation. How did you do that?
Well, Salvation Army did that, actually. I was pretty impressed. I actually wasn't working for them at the time, but they became aware of this issue and felt that supported accommodation was something that they could do well. And they made it happen within a very short period of time. So we set up a 10-bed refuge for adult women, and it is entirely privately funded, so we don't have anybody telling us how to run our service. We can run it as we see fit, which means we can you know, really assess people against actually international definitions of slavery and trafficking, and really meet the needs of those people so that it's a very client-driven, client-focused service.
Someone mentioned about the 457 visas. Are they being abused that you know
of? Look, there has been allegations of that. The government has done, the previous government did some tightening up. The current government is again looking to loosen it up. It can be quite complex though. There are some built-in safeguards around 457s, but at the same time that I'm immune to. But often this notion of migrant workers all get lumped under the 457 visa when there actually are other visas. So for example, 457 visa holders are not permitted to work in agriculture. So the people who get exploited in agriculture are normally 417 visa holders. So, you know, in the community there can be a bit perhaps misperception about what kind of visas are actually problematic for different industries.
457 is the one we always hear about, so
Indeed.
maybe it gets a bit of a bad rap. Thanks, Sandra, for popping in.
Pleasure. Thank
That's
you.
great. To see more of Sandra in Street Talk, head over to theexchangetv.com.au. We'll be back with more right after this. Welcome back. Mark and Jenny, I'd like to get your response to the question of what can people do to make a difference for those who might be in slavery?
Well, look, I mean, I come from the very kind of practical point of view of running a service and just doing community outreach and awareness raising. Visit our website, endslavery.salvos.org.au. We've got tools on there, ways to get involved. If you're in Sydney and you want to volunteer, that'd be great. But we are a national project as well. If you are a school students are engaging on this issue, and we will support you if you want to get involved. So get educated and use the tools that we've created, because they're meant to make a difference and they're meant to be measurable tools.
Fabulous. Mark?
Look, for us, the biggest call we've been making is on government to take the right steps to ensure that goods and services that we purchase are free of slavery and human trafficking. The best way to get involved, there are a whole bunch of organisations involved in that campaign. So my own organisation, the United Church, but we work with the Salvation Army, Stop the Traffic, Australian Catholic Religious Against Human Trafficking. So there's a whole bunch of anti-trafficking, anti-slavery organisations that people can get involved with and really say, you know, every time you go and buy a good, you don't want to have to be asking a whole bunch of questions to find out whether that good was made with slavery. That's just not realistic. Really, we need to know that when we go and buy goods or purchase services, that we can be confident that they're not made with slavery or human trafficking or forced labour.
What about if in some ways we do boycott some of the areas that are? What happens to those people back in those factories, hard-working people, that this was maybe their only form of income? What can we do to help support? If we close down supplies, what do we do to support the people on the other end?
Look, normally we don't promote boycotts. What we promote is trying to get improvement in conditions and trying to actually, you know, where possible, eliminate slavery and human trafficking. Because you're right, these people need decent jobs, whether they're here in Australia or whether they're overseas. So our aim is to make sure all people have decent jobs. That's the focus. It's not about shutting jobs down. There are occasionally situations where the boycott makes sense. So, for example, cotton out of Uzbekistan, where the regime there forces 1 to 2 million people into forced production around cotton. In that case, those people are losing out on education and jobs they already have. So a boycott there makes sense because you're actually helping them get back to school or get back to work.
Well, that's aimed more at the government then, isn't it?
That is aimed at the government. But normally our position is not to boycott, but is actually to try and put pressure on industries and governments to make sure people have decent jobs and to eliminate slavery and forced labour out of supply chains.
Fabulous. Mark and Jenny, thank you so much for your time today. Don't forget, we'd love to hear your thoughts and ideas on what's important to you and what you think we should address on The Exchange. Hope you can join us next time.
Bye for now. See you soon.